monumental miscellanea, and funerary paraphernalia. It's Archaeodeath.
Welcome everybody to this video in support of the 1st of June conference organised by the Dyke Association and led by the Dyke Collaboratories, Professor Keith Ray and myself, Professor Howard Williams. And this day conference is going to be combined with this online content, and the theme is conflict, collaboration and the early medieval frontiers. But we're actually talking about collaborations past and present, both in terms of research networks and creative endeavours in borderlands and frontier zones. And in that regard, I'm delighted to be joined by Diana and John, who will introduce themselves in a minute, and to talk about art and the Anglo-Welsh borderland. And they'll be appearing at the event, but we wanted some online content for those that can't make it and those who want to find out about more about what they're showing on the day and what they're discussing at the conference. And we've always tried in the Offa's Dyke Journal, which is linked to the event. This is volume 5 to promote these interactions between art and archaeology and heritage, and Diana and John contributed to Offa's Dyke Journal 5. So welcome both. Would you mind introducing yourselves and how you come to know each other and what your interests are?
You go first, John, and then I'll fill in the bits.
I'm John Swogger. I'm an archaeological illustrator, which I suppose should be the reason why I'm interested in art, but it isn't. I'm actually interested in art for completely different reasons, in a sense. But they obviously cross over and intersect with illustration. And I suppose if we're talking about frontiers and borderlands, I do sometimes end up sitting in that frontier, that borderland between illustration and art, between archaeology and something else. And because I live not all that far from Offa's Dyke, I also am a local person, an ordinary person, somebody who lives in the borderlands. And so Offa's Dyke for me is as much a part of my everyday local landscape as it is a part of my archaeological and illustration interests. So I met Diana, gosh, I was trying to actually calculate the numbers, but it was almost 20 years ago.
Probably,
50?
yeah, probably.
Years, something like that.
Yeah.
When Diana moved to the village, and we ended up neighbors. And really, from that first summer that you moved here, started doing art together, or was it a little bit later when you went to Glendower?
I'm forgetting the years. You can't expect an old lady to remember all that sort of stuff. But once I retired, I decided I wanted to do an art course. And so I went to North Shropshire College and did a BTEC, and I loved it. And I became Student of the Year there at a great age of 60 or whatever I was. And someone said, well, why don't you go on and do a degree? So I thought, well, that would be fun, wouldn't it? And so I applied and I got in, and I met the most wonderful tutor, a mulatto dressed in red, who'd been to Venice. And he said, have you been to Venice? And have you rubbed the pig's nose? Because if you rub the pig's nose, you'll go there again. And I've never forgotten that. Unfortunately, he's dead now, but he was a lovely teacher. So I did my degree and I got a first, and I got really excited about things, and I started selling in London. I have been selling ever since. And then I decided, well, it's time for an MA, really. So I went back and did an MA in art practice and learnt some more, and that was really good fun. And all the while, John and I were meeting and discussing things, and then we started putting on exhibitions together, didn't we? John came up with a fantastic idea. He said, why don't we have an exhibition outside? And it was after I'd said something about, well, there are all these pictures of outside hanging inside. Could we turn it round the other way and look at the outside and maybe do something with that? So our first exhibition, 2008, wasn't it? Mavis Nicholson came and opened it, and she loved it, and loads of people came, and we persuaded all these artists that we knew to make things, and we persuaded all the people and their gardens to let us display them. And so it was a wonderful afternoon, wasn't it, John? The sun shone, and we had ceramic teapots and cups hanging in trees above the stream, and people wandering around having a wonderful time. And so we then did it again the next year, I think, and we did it we did it at night then, and we had projections on the sides of the buildings. And then John's wife, Freya, who mustn't be left out of this, John, she decided, didn't she, that we would do a wonderful show down in Pandy Mill, where there was a glass artist, and that was all lit up, and that was extremely exciting. She projected things onto the sides of walls. And then we did other exhibitions, one in Oswestry, in an old chapel, projections, made artifacts and things like that. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it, never ever regretting meeting Freya and John. It's been a very enriching part of my life. And I'm a bit on a, what shall I say, on a plateau at the moment, because moving has taken a lot of energy. So I'm not doing quite so much. But when John mentioned the Offa Dyke situation, and I have a raven coming to my garden every day now to eat, and he brings a load of jackdaws. Jack and the Daws come as well. Major Pie and Maggie come, and all sorts of big birds come. I suppose I'm getting inspired by that. And so my Offa Dyke one is about the feathers that people leave on the posts.
Oh,
Yeah.
fantastic. Yes. So
I don't think there's any, personally don't think there's a great deal of difference between archaeologists and artists, because if you look at all the wonderful things that archaeologists find, it's all about the art of other people from other times, and they tell us all the messages that we need to know, really. So,
well, I suppose we are decoders of other people's creative endeavors and trying to make stories from them about that meaningful for us. And so it's art in multiple ways, you know, as you know, we are trying to create meaningful stories. But yeah, there is a lot of synergies there. And so we've got interfaces between disciplines, we've got interfaces between people and creative collaborations. But what about the borderlands itself? I mean, obviously the landscape projected upon, worked within, displayed within is part of what you do. But how does the borderland, what is a borderland? How do we from an artist's perspective, what is that space, you know, that you call the Welsh English border, or the Cymric, you know, whatever, you Anglo, you know, what is this landscape? What makes it so different or distinctive, if anything?
Well, I mean, they say more people in Oswestry talk Welsh than in Wrexham. So, you know, it's a bit weird, really, isn't it? You've got even that crossover over the border. There's that interchange going on. And Wales is a wonderful place. And I've never lived anywhere as exciting as Wales, even though I've travelled a bit when I was younger. But the trees and the natural world and all the archaeology and the hills are just super. And then, of course, you move into England and you've got the hill fort there, so that sort of takes it into England. So I suppose it's just a special place celebrating all the good things about life, really.
It's difficult though, because you ask what the borderlands is, and for us it's simply home. And so you tend to sort of, you know, when somebody says what's different about this landscape, well, it's the place that I live. I mean, you know, it's what I'm used to, it's what I see every day. And so sometimes trying to step out of that can be a little bit difficult, and that's partly the role of art, isn't it, that it makes you look at things in somewhat different ways and recognize, sort of look for particular themes and differences and notes and melodies and harmonies and all that sort of thing. And you start to listen to different kinds of things within this otherwise very familiar, very workaday sort of landscape. And then, of course, you go somewhere else and you realize that other places don't have Offa's Dyke, and they don't have hill forts, and they don't have mountains, and they don't have the Shropshire Plains. And it's only then that you really start to figure out how different your home is from other places. And that too gives you another kind of perspective. And I think it is interesting that in all the artwork that we've done together, it's always been within this landscape. I mean, we've never gone any further than Old Oswestry.
Well, we did reach out back down to Cardiff and
to other hill forts.
hill forts.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, at one level, you know, some people try to treat borderlands as not fully something else they should be. Either, you know, they're not as Welsh as, or not as English as, and you know, it's not about just a mix of two. It's something apart, isn't it? It's something that, you know, sits outside of that sort of binary of nationhoods. Is that a fair thing to say? I don't know.
No, I don't think it's bad at all. And I mean, the friendships that I've made up here on both sides of this border, they're equally strong. It doesn't make any difference that we live on a border. Well, it's a construct, isn't it, by human beings, which derive from fighting and
but that awareness of the fighting, because I've talked to John about this before. This awareness of Offa's Dyke as a manifestation of past divisions, but also past connections. It's both, and its redundancy can be celebrated, but it's likewise it's not fully expunged. There is it echoes down to us about division as well. It's not, you can't write it off as just, oh, we can now harmonize across this divide, because there are still divides and differences, and that's not always bad. There are celebrations in diversity, but equally in division. But also, you know, it does speak in really complex ways to people, doesn't it? So I mean, how do we as artists contend with this kind of monstrous, you know, earthwork that carves through this, or earthworks, because we've got Watts Dyke as well in the northern part of the Anglo-Welsh borderlands. How do we cope with these big, sort of almost like monstrous entities from the early Middle Ages that sort of skulk across our landscape and sort of reveal themselves in places? Do we ignore it, or do we try and interact with it as artists? Because we as we were discussing in relation to Offa's Dyke Journal 5, some artists, you know, it's not the most aesthetically pleasing thing, and sometimes it's easier to look out from it rather than to look at it. And I'm just interested in that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, it's going in close and looking at the small things and the earth, and thinking if you can make paint with the earth, and what you can do with what's there, and what you can create. So, I mean, I can remember when we celebrated the hill fort. We've celebrated the hill fort in Oswestry numbers of times. Made a big banner that the children printed their hands onto, laying their hands on the hill fort, as it were. But we used the mud. We used the mud to make the handprints, and so of course that was fun. Griff Rhys-Jones was there, wasn't he? We got the banner with his handprint on, because he got very excited about it when he was invited to come. But I think, for me personally, it's getting in smaller and closer, but for another artist, it might be something completely different. It might be the bird sounds above, or the water, and you change, I think, as an artist. You don't stay the same, because different things inspire you as you go through life, and you change as well yourself. So,
but it is about the earth itself as well. For you, it's that engagement with the ground. Yeah.
Yes, and the idea of digging into it and finding out something that someone has done millions of years ago is just magic, really.
And Oswestry Hill Fort obviously has that complex story. That it's I mean, the early, sort of early farmers were there. Bronze Age, I'm not so sure about. I don't know about that, but certainly by the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, it's a big fortified hilltop. Then we have
Yeah.
the legends associated with it, but we also have the Mercian frontier work of Dyke cutting
Yeah.
it up, running up to it, and out the
Yes.
other side. So it's a fantastic sort of icon sitting next to Oswestry, and of course it's an icon under threat. And so your art has been been part of a purpose, hasn't it, to raise awareness and to engage people in that site.
Yeah.
Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's well, we fought and fought, didn't we, John? And we've not got anywhere, but they haven't built anything yet. So we're just crossing our fingers that something happens at some point, that it doesn't happen.
Well, it was interesting because the art was almost sort of happened incidentally around the hill fort. So the campaign had been organized, and people were coming to meetings, and there were protests, and there were sort of demonstrations and all that kind of thing, and hugging the hill fort, and all those events were taking place. And the art just came out spontaneously. So there was the banner, then there were other things, and then, you know, once we had a couple of ceramicists involved, once mud started to make its appearance, then of course there was moving on to pottery, and then what do you put in pots, and then so there was all sorts of stuff that came out of that. And Diana organized an exhibition of all the art that had been done, and it was that exhibition that gave birth to this idea of a hill fort creativity group, and kind of trying to see what it was that people were doing up there, what it was that the hill fort was inspiring in them. And so that group brought together poets and musicians and sculptors and writers and painters, and yeah, everything. And it was really interesting to see how much people had the hill fort in mind, even if in their other work it hadn't necessarily appeared. But as soon as you said, well, you know, we're sort of getting this group together about art about the hill fort, well, all of a sudden people just couldn't stop making the stuff. And even when we were not able to go to the hill fort as much during the pandemic, we still managed to create a collaborative work about the hill fort and send it out on tour. So there is something really significant, I think, about places like Old Oswestry, places like Offa's Dyke. They loom large in people's minds, even if they don't necessarily, until prompted, loom large in their art. But as soon as you give people the suggestion, there's lots and lots of stuff there. And it was very different, wasn't it? It wasn't, no one person, no two people were inspired or produced works that called on the same thing.
No, which was amazing, really.
It was. Yeah.
So it's less art of that landscape, that borderlands landscape and its archaeological monuments, but art for that landscape and its monuments. Sort of it's creating engagements for people and connections for people.
And you suddenly see, don't you, that this large hill, this monument has so many different facets to it. And so if you're trying to understand how local communities relate to these things, you have to very much broaden your horizon and broaden your expectations as a heritage worker, as an archaeologist, to sort of encompass all the different things that people are seeing there, not just the birds, not just the trees, not just the archaeology, but, you know, memories of sledding there with grandpa 20 years ago. The idea of Oswestry, in the case of the hill fort, the idea of Oswestry as a rural town, not a suburban town, you know, filled with lots and lots of housing development. Those sorts of identities are all wrapped up with the idea of the hill fort, and it was that was coming out in a lot of the art that people were making.
Yeah, and then there's the idea of the hidden, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Send your imagination off wildly.
That's the thing, isn't it? I was at Stonehenge recently, a site I try to actively ignore as much as possible, but it's always struck me that people can be so inspired by built megalithic or brick or built architectures, but find earthworks more complex, more difficult, more challenging. But at least for hill forts like Old Oswestry, and for linears like Dyke that runs up and through it and around it, they are challenging, and many people don't get it or even see them, but they do. Is that they do conjure something for the imagination, don't they? In a way that, you
Yeah.
know, I don't know what you feel about that. How much earthworks, you know, bumps and lumps are difficult for people to get their head around, but also they do, you know, get people thinking. I don't know.
Well, it's that, to me, it brings back memories of playing in mud, like children love, don't they? But they're often told not to, or they're cleaned up, you know, bathed afterwards, and not given the time perhaps that they really should have with it. So there's a sort of, you know, that's dirt. So maybe there's a bit of that going on as well. And I don't know. It's just
I mean,
throw that.
I think people do see earthworks, but they don't necessarily see them in terms of archaeology or monumentalism. I think they see them as ways of dividing up the landscape that then affect what they do. So if you're going out for a walk with the dog and you go every morning and you come up against this thing, you know, like water, you've got two choices. Do you try and go over it, or do you walk along it? And so inevitably, you know, you walk along it. And that's, I think it's one of the reasons why people like Old Oswestry, because it's the earthworks, the ramparts there actually provide you with a ready-made course to walk around. I mean, you're not, you know, you're not climbing Everest. You're just going, you just need to walk the dog and, you know, get your head together for the day. And the ramparts provide that for you. And I think the same is true of Offa's Dyke. It's astonishing. You talk to people going out who are going out for a walk here, and it's like, where are you going? Well, we thought we'd just walk up to Offa's Dyke and then along and then back. And it's because it kind of stops you from rambling meaninglessly over the countryside and provides you with a ready-made route. And you don't even need to know what it is. So that's one example. And I think there's, you know, farmers would come up with the same kind of thinking about Offa's Dyke, but they wouldn't talk about walking. They'd say, oh, well, you know, it's a convenient place to dump all the dead wood and all the stones and so on, because it's the end of the field. And it's like it's the end of my land. It's the end of my world. And then you just run along it and you come back. And so again, it has meaning, but it's not as an archaeological monument.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness, yes. You've given me loads of thoughts there, John.
This is what happens when we sit down and start talking, is we start bouncing ideas off of each other, and then before you know it, we've got 3 exhibitions and 10 artworks all planned. And this is what it was like when we both lived in the village, and Diana moved 6 months ago. And before that, we had this little bridge across the stream which was in danger of collapsing, and so I would trot across and we'd sit down and have a cup of tea, and then about 4 hours later we'd say, well, you know, really we must get back to whatever it was we were supposed to be doing today. Yeah, so it's just as well you've moved, Diana, because now I can get some work done.
Yeah.
So you obviously been involving lots of people who are not, perhaps do not describe themselves as artists, who perhaps don't, you know, and there's that participatory aspect I was interested in. I mean, is this something that, you know, it doesn't really matter what medium it is, whether you're making pots or painting pictures, or, you know, whatever artistic connection there is, the landscape can be, that can be a connection. The art can be a way to engage with not necessarily history, or but that's something about the traverse landscape, walking, cycling, you know. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is. I mean, I used to teach well, I've taught all age group, but I used to teach infants on Epsom Downs, and it was a lovely area, and it was a race course, of course, which was a bit terrifying for some children. But in those days, you could take a group of 6-year-olds out with the dinner lady. That was all you needed to do. You didn't have to fill in loads of forms to plan it in 3 weeks' time. You could go out when the sun shone, and the children went into those areas, those green leafy areas, and we just let them be. You know, they collected what they wanted, and they met, and that's artistic. That's art that was going on, what they brought back and then drew and created with it all. And I think our society has lost some of that, and we've really got to go back and discover it, especially for the little ones. Start there.
We were very keen when we set up the Hillfort Creativity Group in Oswestry, that it wasn't just to be about the visual arts, and it wasn't just to be about fine arts, because sometimes some of the most interesting expressions actually come out of areas where the classification, the frontiers of classification start to break down. Yes, you may be an illustrator, but are you making a sculpture? Yes, you might sell paintings, but what are you doing? Are you writing a song? So I mean, it's all those breaking down of borders that using a term like creativity inspires rather than just art. And we also worked as much as we could with children. So we had kids coming up on the Hillfort. We did kids activities during Heritage Open Days. We ran a whole series of creative Saturdays at Oswestry Library. And partly that was to give something to the kids, but also it was to allow the artists to sit there and get them away from their oils and their expensive clays, and sit there and color in coloring books and play with Lego and mess. Yeah, because that also is about breaking down those borders which you establish around yourself in terms of practice.
Yeah, definitely.
So do you think that the scale of monuments like Watts Dyke and Offa's Dyke, as opposed to, say, a hill fort or a burial mound or a old workhouse or whatever it may be, creates more challenges or opportunities for doing this kind of art? Because the scale of these monuments, they don't survive in many places, but when they do survive, they're maybe not sitting in hermetically sealed heritage areas. They're just part of lived landscapes, rural or suburban. So I mean, how does that scale of monuments create a problem, or is that something that people seem to be fascinated with? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I suppose when you talk about it like that, for me, I imagine that many people think, oh, well, that's walking. Actually, that's walking, and I don't walk that much, so maybe I won't. Which is a shame, isn't it? Because you could just go there and find something and do something in a very small scale. Maybe people need to be shown that.
I wonder if we don't have that anyway. I'm always interested in the way that people refer to a road that they know that they use locally by its national name, the A5. It doesn't bother me that the A5 runs all over the country, is quite a big, long road. The only bit of the A5 that matters here is the little bit of the A5 that you go from Chirk down to Corwin. That's it. Yeah. A5 itself might extend on to some other part of the country, some other part of Wales, but that's not of any interest to us whatsoever. The A5 is sort of, the A5 that we know blurs out down below Corwin, and then, it becomes indistinct. And maybe the same thing is true of something like Offa's Dyke. We tend to assume that demarcated sites are easier to cope with, but then don't people just demarcate the section of Offa's Dyke that they know? When I say Offa's Dyke, I mean the bit probably from this side of Chirk Castle to Llanymynech Rocks. I don't really mean, when I say Offa's Dyke, I don't really mean the rest of it, because even though I know the monument extends much further, this is my bit. This is the bit that I know.
Yeah, I think that's very true, John.
And I think the same was true of the Hillfort, wasn't it? People said, oh, well, I'm going up to do something inspired by the Hillfort. And then, as you pointed out, Diana, they focused right down on the sand and dirt, and they weren't actually looking at the Hillfort, but they called that little bit of it the Hillfort because that's what they were focused on. And that's another thing I think with art, is that artists like playing with scale. They like playing with focus.
And that's so important, isn't it? Is people connecting with the small part of something bigger doesn't detract from, you don't have to master it all. You don't have to walk from one end to the other before you can claim it in colonial style. As I have taken this monument, and I've wrestled with it. You are capturing or engaging with your own distinctive stories of it, and that plurality. Because I do worry about these kind of branding of monuments with labels and edges and fixed routes and walking paths. Well, I think that's a great way for exercise and heritage preservation. It does kind of create these very clear boundaries for
And we're much happier thinking fuzzily anyway. I think it's a little bit of a myth that people need hard edges and straight lines. I mean, I think most people's thought processes are pretty blurred and pretty indistinct anyway. And again, that's one of the things you're taught in art. When you draw something, are you really drawing it? No, you're just making completely random marks on a piece of paper, and you're saying that is the hill fort.
Yeah.
So tough question for, sorry, Diana, you go.
No, I couldn't add to that, Howard, at the moment.
I was going to ask, perhaps as a last question, where you see art in the future in relation to linear monuments for the Anglo-Welsh borderlands or elsewhere. I mean, from the Berlin Wall to other modern divisions, art always ends up on and responding to these edifices built to divide or to control. I wonder what the future could be in store for this kind of, artistic engagement with walls and borders and frontier works of other kinds.
Well, it can be as broad as any response, artistic response. I think people have to be encouraged to play or to feel, be given permission, as it were. You don't have to you don't have to put your walking boots on if you don't want to. No. You can keep your plimsolls on. You can stay there, and you can examine the bugs or whatever. It's looking at the different scales that you could deal with and what you're interested in, what you really like. Anyway.
It allows that personalization, doesn't it? As you say, of why people care about a landscape, maybe, or things that are significant or spiritual even about landscape will vary considerably.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's it really for me.
Yeah,
anyway.
and I think sometimes the discussion of frontiers and everything comes down to this idea of dividing and setting aside and defining A on this side and B on the other. And I doubt that most people's experience of any kind of frontier or borderline is that straightforward. And yet so much of that seems to get lost in the mix a lot of the time. And so some people are quite happy to have a border. Some people don't really see it. Some people actually think of it as marking out something else, the past from the future, that kind of thing. So there are all those complicated interactions that maybe the whole purpose of having art connected to frontiers and borderlands is to try and tease out some of those subtleties and nuances and strange things. I certainly think that the art that we got back from old Oswestry was in many ways very surprising. Yes, you saw the ramparts and the trees and the birds and so on, but you actually saw very different things there. And I don't think any of us necessarily anticipated that we would see them when we started out. In fact, we didn't know that we were going to have any art at all. That was kind of the whole point, that the actual art itself was a surprise, let alone what was inside it.
Mm-hmm.
In what regard? You just hadn't planned it, or?
No, we hadn't planned it at all. We were there to protest the housing development. I mean, that was the whole point of everybody.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it was that then provided the impetus for people to make things, and then it was the making things that then provided the impetus for the group. So it's not like Diane and I marched up to Old Oswestry and said, right, now what this hill fort really needs is a creativity group.
Yeah.
And that's really constructive, because so much heritage involving art is funded in by particular pots of money that have to say what they're going to do, when they're going to do it, who's going to benefit, who's going to turn the lights off, and all these type of things. And while that utilitarian stance on art is now widespread, there's something to be said for that spontaneity and art coming out of a protest, coming out of inspiration from the landscape and the place, and an art that isn't to fulfill a budget of a heritage whatever fund, or and with a set number of forms saying I enjoyed myself from someone. There's a freedom there that should not be, perhaps, I don't know what you think about that.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And there was another sort of part, another lesson I suppose we could take away from the Hill Fort group, which is the first thing we did was get people who called themselves artists to group together. That's the first thing. And Diana, you were the one that originally told me that the definition of an artist is anyone who describes themselves as an artist. And that was very much our approach. And so we had people that were professional, were practicing, were amateur, had never done anything before in their life, and it was out of that mix, that indiscriminate mix, that all the stuff came.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's giving people permission. It's, I mean, the worst thing possible that I can remember as an infant in an infant classroom when I was a child was that, if the teacher comes along and tells Johnny that the fire engine he's drawn, he sits next to you, is lovely, great, and says nothing about your fairy doll or whatever it is you've done, and she walks away, then what you internalize is that you're useless. You can't do art because she didn't praise you. So you have to be really very careful, I think, with people and give them permission to go and do, but not make the parameters too hard.
There's a comics artist I really like called Linda Barry, and she runs classes in art and memoir and comics out in America. And she says that most people stop making art for precisely that reason at the age of about 7 or 8, when their art is compared, even unintentionally, to somebody else's. And so when she starts teaching undergraduates, she has to take them back to age 7. And one of the things that she said was, with her first class, she said, right, you're going to come into the research lab and you're going to meet your research assistants. And so all the students were, oh, right, okay, so I'm going to meet my research assistant. Then they went into the lab, and all the furniture was the tiny little infant school furniture that you see. And they thought, what's going on? What's going on? She said, well, that's the correct size for your research assistants. And so the undergraduates were then introduced to the research assistants, who were a bunch of 7 and 8-year-old kids. And it was kind of, making the point that was where they were going to start. They were going to start where they had left off. And so.
Whether it's about yourselves or more broadly, my final question is what do you see about the future here? What do you see art doing in the borderlands, and for what's Dyke and Offa's Dyke more specifically? What could be done?
Oh, it's a big question, Howard.
I know. I've thought about this a lot, Howard, because you ask at just about every opportunity, what is borderlands? What is that? What does that mean? What is it? Well, here's a way of finding out. That's what I think it's for. That's what I think it could do. I think it could kind of nail down the very, very scattered and disparate bits and pieces of that definition and of that question. And I think it could have real value, not just for archaeologists and heritage workers working with something like Offa's Dyke, but people working with planning, people working with the environment, people working with roads, people working with schools and policies of all kinds. Like, who are these people that live here? What do they want? What do they see? Who do they see themselves as? And what kind of a place do they think they're living in? And art, I think, is a really good way of getting to that.
It's a great vehicle for that. Yeah.
We could go. Go on, Tyler.
No, I'll just ramble on for ages.
Well, I was going to say we could ramble on for ages, but perhaps this is an appropriate point to thank you both. Let's look forward to seeing you on the 1st of June, if you can make it, and interested in hearing more about the feathers, because they intrigue me. But for now, thank you so much both for sharing your perspectives on long-term artists for landscape, or artists for the borderlands as much as anything else. And it's really, really, really a privilege to have this chance to chat and to have this artistic component to our sort of academic, historical, archaeological deliberations. It's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.